During the middle years of the First Great War, it appeared to the Triple Entente alliance of Britain, France, and Russia that Germany and its Central Powers might strangle out a victory, if even the conflict would have a victor at all. By 1917, neither German nor French forces had made significant gains along the seemingly deadlocked Western Front, even in spite of France having drawn in several more allies since the outbreak of the conflict, and Germany having solidified its dominance throughout Central Europe. The Ottomans were holding strong against Entente invasion, Bulgaria had made significant land gains by dividing Serbian territories with Austro-Hungary, and Germany had, for 3 years now, significantly wounded Russia on the Eastern Front, actively sowing the seeds for civil discontent within the Russian Empire, and harvesting the fruit of that discontent come the removal of the Tsar from power, and the rise of the Bolsheviks, a change of power which not only knocked Russia out of the fight, but cleared the way for numerous German client states to be carved out of Eastern Europe and Caucasia. The Entente still held behind it a few advantages, however, foremost being that it successfully closed Germany and the Central Powers off from outside resources via a blockade in the North Sea. Even had Germany access to the Atlantic, its colonies too had been occupied in an Entente effort to defeat the Germans through a method of attrition, bringing them closer to starvation every day that the war remained stagnant. Germany and Austria, holding domain over much farmland in Central Europe, had also effectively crippled their own domestic food supply by drafting a majority of these resource-producing farmers into the army. The recently ceded lands from Russia were intended to fill gaps in German demand for coal, grain, and industrial production. However, these client states proved difficult to manage during wartime, greatly delaying the planned resource extraction, already siphoning off a portion of Germany's army for occupational purposes when such soldiers could have been put to more effective use in the West. There simply wasn't any more manpower to spare in order to bring these new domains in line faster. With Germany's chief opportunity to tip the scales in its favor having proved a slow and costly process, the Entente drew in its own scale tipper, the United States. Initially, the United States approached the European conflict with a traditional neutrality. However, recent years had seen Britain make overtures for greater cooperation between itself and the US, recognizing the growing naval and industrial might the US, and Japan for that matter, had possessed, as well as their potential to become leading world powers in the coming decades. This, of course, had led to an increased level of intermingling between British and American interests, money from US businesses finding itself overseas or vice versa, mutual understandings of each other's spheres of influence being well established, and personal friendships between national leaders having been made. The result of this had been the emerging, or rather rekindling, of a pro-British mentality among some Americans, most typically those in the upper classes, and most especially those of Old English heritage in the Northeast. Individuals like then-former President Theodore Roosevelt had even promoted what came to be known as the Preparedness Movement, an effort to train the American populace, promote conscription, and campaign for military expansion, so that if the war came to America, they would not be caught off guard. The movement did take a realistic look at lacking American military might, and offered just criticism that despite bearing so large a population, then-present American war power stood at roughly 5% that of France or Germany. That said, the movement initially failed to make a significant difference as President Woodrow Wilson continued attempting to keep the United States neutral. A lack of preparedness would have ultimately left the US making minor contributions upon the early days of its entry into the war. However, the sheer scale of American industry and organization allowed for a rapid evening of the odds. Wilson's continued efforts at neutrality and eventual break reflect quite closely the mindset of several Americans at the time. 1914 had seen minor public backlash at Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality, something additionally fed by Britain's anti-German propaganda. Germany was seen as an aggressor and a villain, however, they weren't America's villain. Whatever threat Germany posed to American sovereignty in the long term remained non-existent in the minds of the average American. Not long after, Germany's torpedoing of the RMS Lusitania sent a shock to the common American psyche, appearing as though Germany had attacked a harmless passenger vessel, costing the lives of several Americans who happened to be on board. To add context to the matter, Britain had sought to starve Germany out by establishing a naval blockade in the North Sea. Germany, in retaliation, sought to enforce its own blockade against Britain through the torpedoing of British merchant vessels via U-boats. It had been established between Germany and Britain that their waters and those of the North Sea were officially a war zone. Britain soon after would make it a point to fly false neutral flags in order to avoid attacks by German vessels, and given the dire circumstances of the conflict for Germany, a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare was adopted, treating any non-German vessel in said waters as potentially belonging to Britain. Additionally, German submarines were discouraged from surfacing or making their presence known via warnings, as Britain had made it a standard procedure for merchant vessels to fire upon or ram any U-boat regardless of if it had initiated hostilities. Germany had discovered through an intercepted message that at the time the Lusitania had been carrying many tons of ammunition for the British war effort and would be flying no flags. In summation, the ship was an active participant in the war both on account of its cargo and its orders to attack German U-boats on sight, and was then within the active war zone when it was downed. What differentiated it from other torpedoed ships was its large count of passengers, many of which were American, which Britain very likely knew were being put in danger, and whose demise might have provoked the US into war against Germany, much to Britain's own benefit. A young Winston Churchill infamously writing a week before the Lusitania's sinking, quote, "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hope of especially embroiling the United States with Germany." President Wilson declared Germany's actions not only morally barbaric, but a violation of the freedom of the seas principle, a violation of American neutrality, and ample grounds for war. Hypocritically, Britain had also violated these same principles several times prior by seizing American vessels believed to be en route to Germany. Wilson's threat had been sufficient for the Germans to back down and temporarily cease unrestricted submarine warfare. It would only be with the re-engagement of the policy in 1917 that the US would finally enter the war. By that point, the public had been turned sufficiently against Germany through the propagandizing of the Lusitania incident and German ambitions for the subjugation of America. As we mentioned before, the US turns the tide in the West and Germany is defeated. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, instead of combating the Central Powers, the US joined Germany? The US of the late 19th and early 20th centuries had a remarkably large ethnic German population. This population, concentrated primarily along the industrial Great Lakes states, is estimated to have made up anywhere from a fourth to a third of the total US population, nearly 10% of that total being either first or second generation, and thus likely still holding very close ties to the fatherland and their overseas culture. Waves of German immigration to the US had a profound impact upon national politics even since before the Civil War. Those who arrived having aligned themselves closely with abolitionist, unionist, and Republican causes. Though a handful of these ancestrally German Americans had, by 1900, integrated well into the dominant culture, fresh waves of German immigrants continued to flow in, and it wasn't uncommon to find of the larger cities in the states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and so on, enclaves of proudly and expressly German culture. One might imagine that given this presence, support for the German war effort might have been a strong force which simply fell behind in the wake of the Lusitania incident. However, it would seem that there was never a large call to rally behind Germany and the Central Powers, as much as there was to simply remain out of the conflict. A numerically smaller but more politically active Irish-American population maintained a more aggressive stance against Britain, but even still for the most part didn't call for supporting the Central Powers. What we find is plainly a pro-neutrality majority who over time learned to perceive Germany as a threat. It wouldn't seem there was any particular movement or politician who might have driven the US to support Germany over the Entente. However, there is a series of events which may have shifted American perceptions during the war, and thus led to a drastically different outcome. As we mentioned previously, Britain had at several points made many of the same mistakes Germany had in regard to the US. However, already established goodwill between the two had helped Britain to save face, while Germany appeared increasingly more hostile. Germany had been framed by Britain as a belligerent whose ambitions demanded the subjugation of the world, when in reality Britain itself was the globe-sprawling empire, while Germany simply stood as a rival who might actually challenge that global dominance, and thus break up the British monopoly on colonization. Further, there was an active goal amongst British leadership to coax the US into joining the war, perhaps the ultimate undermining of American sovereignty, and a smack to the face of their growing relationship, as such a thing might come off as Britain still thinking it can manipulate the Americans to fight their wars for them, treating the US as though it's still subject to the British Empire. To be fair, the Germans had also attempted such a thing, to incite pro-German or anti-war protests via labor unions, finance several pro-German or pro-neutrality newspapers, discourage further business with Britain, and incite conflicts between the US, Mexico, and Canada, but unlike Britain, the Germans were caught. This time, things are different. While it's an unlikely scenario which demands very certain events take place, we might suppose that come 1915, Germany never sinks the Lusitania, but Britain continues to harass American merchant vessels. Some months later, as had been the case with a member of the German embassy in our world, a British diplomat forgets his briefcase on a train in New York City, leaving its contents to be discovered and published, incriminating letters detailing British aims of pitting the US against Germany. Anglo-American ties are fractured, and suddenly several Americans see Germany as less of a threat, as many assume the negative beliefs they held were simply lies spread by Britain. Just as in our world come 1916, Germany in negotiation with Pope Benedict would make an appeal for an end to the conflict, restoring pre-war borders save for Germany's overseas territories which would be left for negotiation. The Entente, as in our timeline, dismisses the offer on the assertion that only a total defeat of Germany would be acceptable. In this alternate world, with the US more skeptical of Britain and the Entente, Woodrow Wilson would open direct discussion with German leadership over plans to finally end the war, suggesting cutting off all financial and resource support to the Entente. Britain intercepting these discussions attempts to pressure the US into maintaining trade, something which would ultimately escalate into an exchange of fire, and see the US finally enter the war against Britain. The United States, not yet having built up a large army, would need to begin a rapid militarization process on the mainland, while its navy found itself locked in combat in the Atlantic. Fearing a preemptive strike, all present US forces would be mobilized along the Canadian border, concentrating especially on the northeast. The war in the Atlantic would force Britain to divert a number of its ships away from the North Sea blockade, giving the Germans an opportunity to pick off isolated vessels and gradually break the blockade once additional ships were called to defend Canada. Elsewhere, Britain and Japan would invade the American Philippines, while the last of Germany's African colonies fell to Entente invasion. American forces in the east would advance as far as the St. Lawrence River before finding themselves deadlocked against Canadian defenses. All that could be done is to wait for additional soldiers to be trained, armed, and deployed to the front. In the less densely populated west, however, significant territory is gained with little signs of this advance slowing. Britain, realizing the futility of attempting to fend off a full-scale American invasion of Canada, as well as the necessity to focus on the war in Europe, would essentially abandon the Dominion, leaving it to its own devices, and to inevitably be consumed by the US. By the time Japan and Britain had taken Hawaii, Canada had succumbed to the US invasion, Russia had collapsed, losing several of its western territories, and Germany, no longer restricted by Britain whilst France crumbled in the absence of Anglo-American support, would break the once frozen Western Front and march on Paris. The war was now over, and the US sat alongside the Central Powers in reorganizing the post-war world. While Wilson's 14 points had flown in the face of the Entente's greater imperial ambitions, and thus only saw minor implementation, surprisingly it might actually hold greater pull with the Central Powers, though still not in its purest form. Take for instance point 10, autonomous development for the peoples of Austro-Hungary. Austria was well aware of its great internal divides, and among the possible solutions was a proposed United States of Austria by the late Franz Ferdinand, in which the empire's territory remained united, yet autonomous states are established in relation to each region's ethnic makeup, allowing for equal representation in national politics for the sake of security, while also allowing for regional sovereignty for the sake of cultural self-determination. The same goes for the Turks in point 12, relinquish of Turkish control over non-Turkish populations. The Ottoman Empire was fracturing from its own divides and knew it likely didn't have much longer. However, it still saw a means by which to maintain power in the Middle East, and that was through the retaining of its position as the center of the Islamic world. During the war, the Ottomans had directly and indirectly backed numerous pro-Islamic independence factions in North Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Arabia. Though it likely knew it wouldn't be able to successfully annex and effectively rule over these lands, it could still project its influence through them via Islam, perhaps akin to a more powerful version of what the Papal States had been for Christianity. Germany had already seen to the creation of client states from broken away Russian territory instead of outright annexation, and as such might see an opportunity to both appease the US while maintaining its dominance over various domains. Middle Africa likely being the big exception, as it would be difficult for the Germans to justify to the US, but regardless, it's very likely they'd still seize on this opportunity to establish the massive colony at the expense of Britain, Belgium, and France, not seeing a similar chance present itself again in the future. The US itself would annex much of Canada's underpopulated west to bridge the disconnect between the contiguous states and Alaska, while Quebec and Ontario, the latter likely retaining the name Canada, are made independent states, though remain well within American influence. Many of Britain's Caribbean possessions would be outright annexed, while others are granted independent status, though with closely regulated governments like Cuba, possibly seeing greater American settlement in the future, followed by annexation. Korea, Indochina, and various other lands in the Pacific are also made officially independent extensions of US influence, and likely achieve total independence at a later point, like the Philippines, though still remain closely allied to the US. This increased presence in the Pacific gives the US a prime opportunity to intervene in China during the warlord period, at which point the Soviets might also attempt to project their influence into the region, while the Japanese militarize locally, preparing to exact revenge on the US for the partition of its empire. Meanwhile, in Europe, as the great new Central European powers consolidate their authority, So do Britain, France, and Italy, crippled by the costs of reconstruction and humiliated by the stripping of their colonies, find themselves too drifting toward nationalistic revenge against the powers who wronged them. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.